All right, this is the last chapter before this Unit 3 test. This is Chapter 18 over gas exchange and transport, and I have shortened it quite a bit. You'll notice that as you go through this video. There are some common definitions on this slide that you should know. First is hypoxia. That means there's too little oxygen in the system, and there's different types of hypoxia, like hypoxic hypoxia, histoplasmic hypoxia, and there's a graph or a table on the next slide that demonstrates the different types of hypoxia. We'll look at that in a second. And then there's hypercapnia. Hypercapnia has to do with increased amounts of carbon dioxide in the system, which can affect your pH. Now, to measure hypoxia and hypercapnia, there are three variables that the respiratory system or your body will look into. First, it's going to be oxygen levels. If your oxygen levels get too low, hypoxia, then there are certain mechanisms in place to help compensate for that. For one thing, there's going to be a local chemical signal that is sent by the capillaries that are surrounding the tissues that are being deprived of oxygen, and it will vasodilate the blood vessels to increase the blood flow to that area. And then there are sensors monitoring your carbon dioxide, like in the medulla and in the aorta and also in the carotid. They have chemoreceptors that are detecting or trying to pick up your carbon dioxide levels. If your carbon dioxide levels get too high in your blood, it makes you acidic, which then makes your pH too low. If there's not enough carbon dioxide in the system, then your pH levels are going to rise and you become more alkaline. And we'll go over that when we get to the next chapter for Unit 4. And then that ties in with the pH. When it comes to gas exchange, we just went over Chapter 17 on the pulmonary system. But fluids and gases move because of a pressure gradient. And there also has to be a partial pressure gradient. This is just a review of what's happening between the cardiovascular system and the respiratory system. We'll start up here with the oxygen. Oxygen is going to come down into the bronchial tree, down the trachea, down into the alveolar duct and alveolus. Then oxygen crosses over into the pulmonary capillary, then it goes through the pulmonary veins, and then the oxygen is going to circulate around, starting in the left side of the heart, then around the systemic arteries. Blood keeps traveling through the systemic arteries until they get to the capillaries, the systemic capillaries, and then there's a gas exchange that occurs here. The oxygen is going to go into the tissues, and then the carbon dioxide is going to go from the tissues into the systemic capillary. And now the blood vessels are going to be turned back to the heart, so we get into some bigger blood vessels, we get into systemic veins, and then we go back into the right side of the heart, and then blood's going to go from the right side of the heart into the pulmonary trunk and the pulmonary arteries until we get to the pulmonary capillaries, and the carbon dioxide goes into the alveolus so that you can breathe the carbon dioxide out. This table is easy to read. It just tells you the different types of hypoxia. For example, hypoxic hypoxia, that is low pressures or low levels of oxygen in your blood, and usually it's due to high altitude. There's not enough oxygen in the air that we can get into your system in order to be delivered to the tissues. That's hypoxic hypoxia. Anemic hypoxia, having low levels of oxygen in your system because you don't have enough red blood cells. So that's anemic hypoxia. Ischemic hypoxia, that is when you have reduced blood flow causing low levels of oxygen. And usually it's due to heart failure or losing blood in an injury, which is causing hypovolemic shock. And then there's histotoxic hypoxia, that is a failure of the red blood cells to work because of some sort of poison. I think that this picture here sums up the most important concept for Chapter 18 and in the respiratory system. And it has to do with gases moving down their pressure gradient. If there's no pressure gradient, then there's no movement of gases. So when we have a gas exchange between the alveolus and the pulmonary capillaries, there has to be some sort of pressure gradient in order for oxygen to move into the pulmonary system and for carbon dioxide to move out of the pulmonary system. Let's look at some numbers. By the time the air that you breathe in into your lungs, but by the time the air reaches the alveolus, the partial pressure of oxygen is 100 millimeters of mercury. Now, if we follow that, what is the partial pressure of oxygen in the systemic veins before they reach the capillaries? They are lower than 40 millimeters of mercury. So, to recap, as the blood is going into the pulmonary capillaries, the partial pressure of oxygen is less than or equal to 40 millimeters of mercury. The oxygen that's in the alveoli, when you breathe in, has a partial pressure of 100 millimeters of mercury. So 100 millimeters of mercury compared to 40 millimeters of mercury. So there's a pressure gradient. So air is going to move down, or oxygen is going to move down its concentration gradient. That's how oxygen moves in from the alveolus into the pulmonary capillary, because it's going down its concentration gradient. All right, let's continue to follow this. So now, the blood that's leaving the pulmonary capillary and the pulmonary veins, it has a partial pressure of oxygen of 100 millimeters of mercury. It stays that way all the way through the heart. And then we get into the systemic circulation. So the partial pressure of oxygen in the systemic circulation is 100 millimeters of mercury. Now let's look at the tissues. And the tissues who take the oxygen, they use it to break down glucose in the mitochondria so that the levels of oxygen in the tissues hovers around 40 millimeters of mercury. So the partial pressure of oxygen in the inside the systemic artery is 100. And then when it gets to the systemic capillaries, it can go from 100 millimeters of mercury down to 40 millimeters of mercury. So it's going to go down its concentration gradient. So we have 100, 100, 100. And then we get to the capillaries. And now oxygen is going to diffuse across the membranes, go into the cells. Now let's look at levels of carbon dioxide. In the tissues, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is greater than 46. The reason for that amount is because the carbon dioxide levels will build after aerobic respiration. So the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the systemic veins is greater than 46. So if we follow carbon dioxide goes into the systemic capillary because it's going to go down its concentration gradient. How do we know that? Because the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the systemic arteries is about 40 millimeters of mercury. So, carbon dioxide levels in the systemic arteries is 40. It's 40, 40, 40, 40, 40. So then 46 in the tissues, that means we're going to go down its concentration pressure gradient into the systemic capillaries. So now the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 46, 46, 46. It goes through the right side of the heart and the pulmonary trunk. 46, 46, 46. Now, what is the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the alveolus? Because you're breathing out carbon dioxide, so it stays around 40. So now we have 46 inside of the pulmonary capillaries, 40 inside of the alveolus, so then carbon dioxide goes down its concentration gradient into the alveolus, and then you can breathe the carbon dioxide out. So if any of these changes, it affects how gases cross and diffuse across the membrane. For example, if you go to areas like climb a mountain, like climb Mount Everest, and perhaps the partial pressure of oxygen on top of Mount Everest is about 39. Well, is that going to make oxygen move into the system? Well, the partial pressure of oxygen, whenever we look at it right here, is less than 40. If it's only 39 in the alveolus, then technically oxygen will actually go into the alveolus and you'll be breathing it out instead of breathing it back in. So there has to be a pressure gradient in order for the molecules to move. I want to remind you that alveolar ventilation, that is air moving into and out of the alveolus. If there's not enough oxygen coming into the alveolus, they call that hypoventilation. Whenever there's an abundance of oxygen coming into the alveolus, that's called hyperventilation. And that's going to affect your pH levels. And again, we're going to look at that again in depth when we get to the next chapter after this test. But some things that lend to hypoventilation: decreased lung compliance. That is the inability of the lungs to go back to its usual shape after it fills with air. Now, the elastic component of the lungs allow the lungs to expand with air when you inhale, and then the lungs are able to squeeze back into its original shape and forces air out. If it loses its lung compliance, that means it's losing the ability to go back to its regular normal shape and size. Another thing that leads to hypoventilation is increased airway resistance. What increases airway resistance? Usually it's going to be contraction of the smooth muscle that surrounds the bronchiole. So bronchoconstriction restricts air going into the alveolus, so it's going to lower the alveolar pressure. And then there's some things that can depress the central nervous system, like alcohol and certain drugs that you take. This slide reminds us that diffusion rate is proportional to the surface area times the concentration gradient times the barrier permeability. We looked at this when we looked at transport mechanisms across the membrane way back in chapter 5. And this is how it works. Anything that increases the surface area of the barrier then will increase the diffusion rate. Anything that increases the concentration gradient will also increase the diffusion rate. Anything that increases the barrier permeability will also increase the diffusion rate, and then it's going to be vice versa. If anything decreases the surface area, if anything decreases the concentration gradient, and if anything decreases the barrier permeability, then that's going to decrease the diffusion rate. And we're going to apply the same principle when it comes to the gas exchange between the alveolus and the pulmonary capillary. So if anything decreases the surface area of the alveolus, then it's going to decrease the diffusion rate of oxygen and carbon dioxide across the respiratory membrane. Anything that decreases the concentration gradient either of oxygen in the alveolus or carbon dioxide in the pulmonary capillary, then that decreases the diffusion rate of the gases across the respiratory membrane. And then anything that decreases the barrier permeability, something that is going to either increase the thickness of the alveolar wall or the thickness of the pulmonary capillary endothelium, then that decreases the diffusion rate. And then the other formula that we looked at in chapter 5 that had to do with diffusion rate is distance. Distance has an inverse relationship to the diffusion rate. So as the distance increases between 2 points, the diffusion rate is going to decrease. So anything that increases the distance between the alveolus and the pulmonary capillary will decrease the diffusion rate. In healthy individuals, normally, the surface area does not change, the barrier permeability does not change, and the diffusion distance does not change if the individual is healthy. So the primary factor that affects gas exchange is going to be the concentration gradient. Let's look at this for a second. In this picture in the far left, it shows you what a normal lung looks like. This is a normal alveolar duct, and then here's the normal alveolar sacs, wherever we have a gas exchange. And here we have normal exchange of gases. Oxygen is normally crossing into the pulmonary capillary. Now let's look at a disease process known as emphysema, right here. Emphysema changes the shape of the alveolar sac, and it decreases the surface area available. So since there's a decrease in the surface area available on the respiratory membrane, then it lowers the levels of oxygen in your system. Then we look at fibrotic lung disease. With fibrotic lung disease, there is a fibrous tissue that builds up around the alveolus. So it decreases the barrier permeability between the alveolus and the pulmonary capillary, and it also will lower the amount of oxygen available for the pulmonary capillary. Whenever there's been a mitral valve prolapse or a bicuspid valve prolapse, that means whenever the left ventricle contracts, the AV valve, the mitral valve, does not close properly, and now some blood can go back up into the left atrium. Well, if there's blood going back up in the left atrium, then it causes a backup of fluid inside of the pulmonary capillaries inside of the lung. So if there's a buildup of fluid in the capillaries in the pulmonary system, then that means there's going to be a high rate of fluid leaving the pulmonary capillaries. They call that pulmonary edema whenever there is fluid inside the lung between the alveolus and the pulmonary capillary. So now the distance between the alveoli and the pulmonary capillary is increased. So if you increase the distance of diffusion, then it makes the diffusion process slower and it causes low levels of oxygen in the system. The other thing that we look at a lot in the respiratory system is asthma. A lot of you may have had asthma as a child or maybe even still suffer from it today. But with asthma, what happens is that the smooth muscle around the bronchioles constricts. Usually it could be due to an allergen or something that you're breathing in, or it could be spontaneous. But whenever that happens, it increases resistance. So we're decreasing the size of the lumen of the bronchiole. So we're decreasing the amount of oxygen that is going into the alveolus, so it's going to lower the amount of oxygen that's going into the pulmonary capillary. The last two slides on this PowerPoint that we're going to look at have to do more with lab than it does with the lecture. But if we look at this graph on the right-hand side, it shows you the oxygen saturation curve of the maternal hemoglobin and then fetal hemoglobin. Basically, if we want to summarize this table or this chart, it's showing us that a fetal hemoglobin has a higher affinity for oxygen than maternal hemoglobin. And then it makes sense. So as the maternal blood reaches the placenta, it's going to come into close contact. It doesn't actually touch, but it comes into close proximity of the fetal blood. And the fetal hemoglobin is designed to pick up the oxygen from the maternal hemoglobin. So as the blood passes through the placenta, the oxygen can then cross through the placental membrane from the maternal hemoglobin into the fetal hemoglobin, and then the fetus can get the oxygen from the maternal blood. The one graph I want to focus on in this slide is going to be this graph right here, showing the effects of pH on the affinity for oxygen. So red is going to be normal because our normal pH is 7.4, so it's showing normal affinity for oxygen. Then what happens whenever our pH gets too high? We become alkaline. Now the oxygen saturation curve goes up, and it makes the red blood cell hold on to the oxygen longer. So whenever you become alkaline, the oxygen stays with the red blood cell more than it's being delivered. Then if you look at a lower pH, which means you become acidic. So some processes that make you acidic will let the red blood cell drop the oxygen faster. So the affinity for oxygen is lower whenever you're slightly acidic. And this is what happens whenever you exercise. Whenever you go into strenuous exercise, you produce lactic acid, and enough lactic acid makes you acidic. So the more acidic you are, then the more the red blood cells can then drop the oxygen off to your tissues. They call this the Bohr effect, B-O-H-R. Now, I'm finished with this chapter for the exam for Unit 3, but feel free to look through the rest of the PowerPoint on your own and then read the chapter. Email me if you have any questions.